Welcome back to Family Ties, the channel that unknots the most sacred and complicated of human bonds to reveal the poison that can sometimes flow through a bloodline. The relationship between a mother-in-law and a daughter-in-law is the stuff of legend, of jokes, of sitcoms. It's a delicate dance of tradition, expectation, and the forging of a new family. But what happens when that dance becomes a duel to the death? What happens when a mother's love for her son curdles into a monstrous, possessive hatred for the woman he has chosen? Tonight's story takes us into the heart of a perfect family, to a home where Sunday dinners were served with a side of seething resentment. We will witness a murder born of pure, unadulterated malice, and a diabolical plot to send an innocent man to prison for a crime he did not commit. It's a chilling reminder that the most dangerous enemy can be the one who greets you with a smile, a perfectly wrapped gift, and calls you family. Before we take our seat at this fatal family dinner, if you're intrigued by the dark psychology that can turn a home into a house of horrors, make sure you subscribe to our channel and ring the notification bell. You wouldn't want to be left off the family tree. Now the table is set. The matriarch is watching from the head of the table. And a daughter-in-law is the Jennings family was the embodiment of the American dream, a perfect, sun-drenched portrait destined for the cover of a lifestyle magazine. Mark Jennings was a successful, kind-hearted pediatrician, a man whose gentle nature and genuine warmth made him beloved by his young patients and their anxious parents. His wife, Emily, was a vibrant and talented graphic designer who worked from a sunlit studio in their beautiful, custom-built suburban home. Their world had been recently completed, made whole, by their 1-year-old son, Leo, a happy, gurgling baby who was the undisputed, adored center of their universe. Their life was a quiet, comfortable tapestry of first steps, sleepy evenings spent reading stories, and the easy, companionable love of a couple who were not just spouses, but best friends. But a single corrosive thread, woven with the fibers of old money, tradition, and an unyielding will, ran through this otherwise perfect tapestry. Mark's mother, Eleanor Jennings. Eleanor was a matriarch of the old school, a woman carved from the ice of a bygone era and the iron of her own indomitable will. A widow for over a decade, she lived in a grand, silent Georgian house in the wealthiest, most exclusive part of town, a home that was less a place of comfort and more a museum to her late husband, a formidable titan of industry, and to her own unyielding standards of perfection. Her love for her only son, Mark, was a fierce, possessive, all-consuming force. To her, Mark was not an independent man, but a masterpiece of her own creation, a living testament to the superiority of the Jennings lineage. And the woman he had married, Emily, was, in Eleanor's cold, calculating eyes, an unforgivable, fatal flaw in that masterpiece. She saw Emily as everything she was not, and everything she disdained. Common, modern, and worst of all, independent. Emily came from a loving but decidedly middle-class background. She had her own career, her own opinions, her own gentle, modern way of raising a child that flew in the face of Eleanor's rigid, authoritarian methods. She had, in Eleanor's view, stolen her son, luring him away from the path she had so carefully laid for him, a path that involved marrying a woman from a similarly prestigious family and polluting the pristine Jennings bloodline with her ordinary sensibilities. Eleanor's hatred for her daughter-in-law was not a fiery, overt thing. Open displays of emotion were, in her world, a sign of weakness. Hers was a cold, patient, and deeply rooted poison, administered in 1,000 tiny, exquisitely calibrated doses. It was in the backhanded compliment about Emily's cooking. Such a charming, rustic dish, dear. My Mark is used to more refined flavors, but it's sweet of you to try. It was in the helpful criticism of her parenting. Are you sure it's wise to let Leo get so dirty? Jennings' children were always kept immaculately clean. It was in the constant, subtle reminders, delivered with a thin, bloodless smile, that she would never, ever be good enough for her son, for her family. Emily, for her part, had tried. For the 5 years of her marriage, she had endured the quiet, relentless campaign of psychological warfare with a grace and patience born of her deep, abiding love for Mark. She knew how much his mother meant to him, the complicated bond of love and duty that tied him to the formidable woman who had raised him. She was determined to build a bridge over the chasm of Eleanor's disapproval, for her husband's sake, and for the sake of her son. It was a bridge Eleanor was equally determined to burn to the ground. The birth of Leo had only intensified the conflict. Eleanor saw the baby not as a grandson to be loved, but as a prize to be won, a Jennings heir to be molded in her own image. He was a second chance, an opportunity to finally wrest control from the usurper and instill the proper values that his mother was so clearly incapable of providing. The tension in the family had become a low, constant hum, a string stretched to its absolute breaking point. The murder was the final, terrible snap of that string. It was a crime of breathtaking cruelty, not only in its execution, but in its diabolical, calculated aftermath. It was designed not just to eliminate an obstacle, but to create a new, unshakable foundation for Eleanor's control. The chosen victim for the frame was a man named Daniel Russo. In his own way, Daniel was as perfectly chosen as the murder weapon. He was the perfect patsy. He was a landscape gardener who had recently done a series of jobs for the Jennings family, so his presence at the house was known and expected. More importantly, he was a man with a troubled past, a past that made him vulnerable, a past that could be easily twisted into a narrative of violence and instability. He had a sealed juvenile record for petty theft, and a more recent conviction for assault, the result of a stupid, drunken bar fight a few years back. He was a man who had paid his dues, a man trying to build a new life, but the ink on his record was a permanent stain, a stain Eleanor was about to use to paint her masterpiece of deceit. Eleanor's plan was a study in psychological manipulation and meticulous preparation. For weeks, she had been laying the groundwork, planting the seeds of a false narrative in the fertile soil of her social circle. She would make casual, worried comments to her friends at the country club, and to Mark during their weekly Sunday dinners about the gardener. "He just seems so intense," she would say with a concerned, furrowed brow. "He has such dark, angry eyes. The other day, I saw him just staring at the house. It gave me a chill." She was creating a phantom menace, a convenient villain for the tragedy she was about to direct. The day of the murder was a carefully chosen Wednesday. Mark was at a day-long pediatric cardiology conference in a neighboring city. He was a keynote speaker. His attendance was a matter of public record, giving Eleanor a perfect, ironclad alibi for her son. Eleanor, in a gesture of grandmotherly generosity, had insisted on babysitting Leo for the day, to give poor Emily a much-needed break. It was an offer that would ensure Emily was home, and completely alone. Eleanor's first move was to establish her own alibi with the precision of a military strategist. She spent the morning at a series of high-profile charity committee meetings, making sure she was seen, heard, and remembered by a dozen influential women. Then, at noon, her social obligations fulfilled, she drove to her son's house. The next part of the plan was brutally simple. She had hired Daniel Russo for one final, small landscaping job that day, to plant a new, expensive rosebush in the backyard, a gift for her dear Emily. She had been firm, almost obsessive, in her instructions to the landscaping company. The work had to be done on that specific day, and at exactly 1:30 p.m. She arrived at the house at 1 p.m. Emily, as always, was warm and welcoming, seemingly oblivious to the serpent she was inviting into her home. She offered Eleanor a cup of tea. They made small talk in the bright, cheerful kitchen, the baby cooing in his high chair nearby. It was a perfect, sun-drenched domestic scene. But in Eleanor's expensive leather handbag, nestled in a soft, silk pouch, was her weapon. A small, heavy, ornate silver letter opener, a treasured heirloom from her late husband's desk. It was sharp, elegant, and completely untraceable to any recent purchase. At 1:25 p.m., she knew Daniel would be arriving. She checked her watch. She made her move. The attack was a study in swift, silent, and utter brutality. While Emily's back was turned, rinsing their teacups at the sink, Eleanor came up behind her. There was no argument, no final confrontation. There was only the cold, hard, and final expression of a lifetime of simmering hatred. She plunged the letter opener into the base of Emily's neck, a single, deep, and precisely aimed blow. Emily collapsed without a sound, a look of shocked, uncomprehending betrayal in her eyes for the brief second before they went vacant. Eleanor, her heart a steady, cold drum, her hands as firm as a surgeon's, immediately went to work. This was the most critical part of the plan, the staging. She dragged Emily's body from the kitchen into the living room, a difficult task that left her breathing heavily, but she was a woman of surprising strength. The smear of blood on the pristine hardwood floor was an unfortunate, but unavoidable, part of the narrative. Then, from her purse she took a small Ziploc bag. Inside was the forensic evidence she had so carefully collected. A single, coarse, dark hair and a small, almost invisible button. She had plucked the hair from the collar of Daniel's work jacket, which he had carelessly left draped over a fence the week before while he worked. The button was from the cuff of the same jacket, carefully snipped off when he wasn't looking. She used a pair of tweezers to place the hair under Emily's fingernails, a final, damning piece of evidence from a struggle that had never happened. She dropped the button near the body, a careless mistake by a frantic, clumsy killer. She then went through the house, creating the illusion of a violent robbery. She knocked over a lamp, its shade askew at a drunken angle. She pulled a few books from a shelf, as if they had been swept aside in a hurried search. She took a small, silver picture frame from the mantel, a photo of Mark and Emily on their wedding day. It was an object of little monetary value, but something a petty thief might grab in a moment of panic. Her final, most diabolical touch was a call to Daniel Russo's phone. She used Emily's phone, which she had taken from the kitchen counter. She let it ring twice, then hung up. It took less than 10 seconds, but it would leave an indelible, digital record of a call from the victim to her killer just minutes before the murder. Her story would be that Emily had become frightened by Daniel's presence, had called him, perhaps to ask him to leave, a call that had triggered his violent, uncontrollable rage. At 1:35 p.m., her work complete, she took the baby, who had been sleeping peacefully in his nursery, oblivious to the horror that had just unfolded downstairs, and left the house through the back door. She was careful to lock it behind her, but leave the front door slightly ajar. She got into her car just as Daniel Russo's landscaping truck was pulling into the driveway at the front of the house. She drove away, her face a mask of calm, maternal concern for the precious cargo in the back seat. Daniel, a man whose only crime was his desire to do an honest day's work, walked into a perfectly set trap. He knocked on the front door. He noticed it was ajar. He pushed it open and called out Emily's name. There was no answer. Thinking she was in the backyard, he walked through the house. He found her body in the living room. He froze, his mind a maelstrom of shock and terror. A man with his record, standing over a dead body in a wealthy suburban home, he knew, with a sickening certainty, what it would look like. His first and most fatal mistake was to act on that fear. He ran. Eleanor, meanwhile, drove to a picturesque park on the other side of town. She spent the next hour there, pushing her grandson on the swings, making sure she was seen and remembered by a dozen other mothers and nannies. At 2:45 p.m., she began her performance. She made a series of frantic, hysterical calls. To Mark at his conference, to her friends, and finally to the police. Her story was a masterpiece of fabricated terror. "I can't reach Emily," she cried into the phone, her voice a perfect symphony of rising panic. "I've been calling and calling. I was supposed to bring Leo back an hour ago. I have a terrible, terrible feeling something is wrong. We had that strange gardener working there today. The one I told you about, Mark. He gave me such a bad feeling." She had planted the seed. She had created the narrative. She had framed an innocent man. And she had done it all without a flicker of remorse, her heart filled only with the cold, triumphant satisfaction of a problem, a flaw in her masterpiece, finally and permanently solved. She was, once again, the undisputed and only queen of her son's life. Detective Miles Corbin arrived at the Jennings's home to a scene that was both tragic and, on the surface, tragically straightforward. A young mother, brutally murdered in the sanctity of her own home. A staged robbery. A prime suspect with a violent past who had been seen fleeing the scene. And a grieving and very helpful matriarch who was providing a clear and compelling narrative. It was the kind of case that detectives dream of, and that defense attorneys have nightmares about, an open and shut book. He was a troubled young man, Detective Eleanor Jennings told him, her voice a perfect, trembling instrument of grief and fear. She sat in a neighbor's kitchen, a cup of untouched tea in her hands, her grandson, Leo, sleeping peacefully in a carrier at her feet, a perfect, innocent prop in her performance. I had a premonition, a mother's intuition. I warned Emily about him, but she was so trusting, so naive. She saw the good in everyone. She recounted her story flawlessly, her timeline precise, her emotions perfectly modulated. The babysitting, her growing unease as her calls to Emily went unanswered, her mounting terror when she finally called the police. She was the perfect witness. Concerned, cooperative, and pointing a firm, unwavering finger at the man who was now the subject of a statewide manhunt. The evidence seemed to fall neatly into place, each piece a perfectly cut stone in the wall of guilt she was building around Daniel Russo. The forensics team found the coarse, dark hair under Emily's fingernails and the button near her body. A preliminary analysis confirmed they were consistent with the type of work clothes a landscaper would wear. The missing picture frame fit the profile of a petty, opportunistic theft. The call from Emily's phone to Daniel Russo's, logged just minutes before the estimated time of death, was the digital nail in the coffin. Daniel Russo was apprehended 2 days later, hiding in a cheap, run-down motel 200 miles away. His flight was, to the police and the public, an open admission of guilt. He was brought in, terrified and inarticulate, his attempts to explain his innocence a fumbling, panicked mess that only served to tighten the noose around his neck. His court-appointed lawyer, an overworked and under-resourced public defender, could see the writing on the wall. The case was a media sensation. The gardener slayed the mother, the headlines screamed. It was a story with all the perfect, lurid elements. A beautiful victim, a salt-of-the-earth villain, a tragic, broken family. Eleanor Jennings was lauded as a hero, the grandmother whose intuition had saved her grandson from a potential killer. She gave tearful, dignified television interviews, becoming a public symbol of grace and resilience in the face of an unthinkable tragedy. Her son, Mark, utterly broken by the death of his wife, clung to his mother as his only source of strength. His grief was a thick, impenetrable fog, making him incapable of questioning the narrative she had so expertly crafted. For any other detective, the case would have been closed, the paperwork filed, the conviction a foregone conclusion. But Miles Corbin was a man who had built a 30-year career on listening to the small, quiet voice of doubt in the back of his mind. And in this case, that voice was screaming. It wasn't one thing. It was 100 small, discordant notes in an otherwise perfect symphony of guilt. It was the neatness of the crime scene, the almost theatrical placement of the clues, the hair under the fingernails, the button on the floor. It felt less like the chaotic, unpredictable aftermath of a violent struggle and more like a carefully arranged diorama in a museum of murder. It was the murder weapon or lack thereof. The coroner had determined the wound was caused by a thin, sharp, stiletto-like object, approximately 6 inches in length. No such weapon was found at the scene, and an exhaustive search of Daniel Russo's truck, home, and the route he had taken in his flight had turned up nothing. A man in a fit of rage would have likely used a tool from his truck, a trowel, a pair of shears, something opportunistic. This murder felt premeditated, the weapon chosen with care, and then disposed of with equal care. And most of all, it was Eleanor Jennings. Corbin had spent hours with her, listening to her story, and while her performance was flawless, he felt a profound, chilling emptiness behind her perfectly sad, perfectly blue eyes. He had seen the raw, messy, unpredictable face of grief 1,000 times. He had seen it in the shattered, incoherent ramblings of husbands and wives, in the silent, catatonic shock of parents. What he saw in Eleanor was not grief. It was control. It was a perfect, unwavering, and utterly chilling performance. Corbin began to do something that no one else had thought to do. He began to investigate the matriarch. He started with a deep dive into her life, her history, her finances. On the surface, she was a pillar of the community, a wealthy widow devoted to her son and her charity work. But then he found the first crack. He spoke to a former friend of Eleanor's, a woman who had been excommunicated from her social circle years ago for some minor, forgotten social transgression. Eleanor doesn't have friends, the woman told him, a bitter, long-nursed edge to her voice. She has subjects. She has a court. And the moment you defy her, the moment you have an opinion that doesn't mirror her own, you are banished. Her love for Mark is not normal. It's an obsession. Biblical. When he married that sweet girl, Emily, Eleanor saw it as the ultimate act of betrayal. She told me once, years ago, at a luncheon, that she would do anything to protect her son from that woman's influence. At the time, I thought she was just being dramatic, a bitter old woman. Now, I'm not so sure. This led Corbin to re-examine the family dynamic. He spoke to friends of Mark and Emily's, a younger, more modern circle than Eleanor's. And a new, darker picture began to emerge. They spoke of Eleanor's constant, subtle undermining of Emily, the quiet, relentless psychological warfare that had been the backdrop of the young couple's marriage. Emily was terrified of her. One of Emily's closest friends, a woman named Chloe, confided, her voice a mixture of sadness and anger. But she was trying so hard, for Mark's sake. Mark, bless his heart, was completely, willfully blind to it. He saw his mother as this perfect, sainted figure, the woman who had sacrificed everything for him after his father died. He couldn't see the poison she was dripping into his marriage, day after day. Corbin's suspicions were now a full-blown theory. Eleanor had the motive. A deep, pathological hatred for her daughter-in-law. A hatred born of jealousy and a desperate need for control. And she had the opportunity, created by the perfect alibi of her son's absence and the convenient, prearranged presence of the gardener. But how could he possibly prove it? The evidence against Daniel Russo was, on its face, overwhelming. The key, Corbin knew, had to be in the details of the frame-up. A frame-up, no matter how clever, is a construction, a lie. And all lies, if you look closely enough, have flaws, have seams. He went back to the physical evidence. The hair and the button. The forensics lab had confirmed the hair was a match to Daniel Russo. But Corbin asked them to do something more. He asked them to analyze the root of the hair. Was it pulled out in a struggle? He asked. Or did it fall out naturally? The lab technician, an old, grizzled veteran who appreciated Corbin's attention to detail, was intrigued by the question. The results came back a day later. The hair had a clean, intact follicular tag at the end. It had not been ripped out in a violent struggle. It had been shed naturally, or plucked with a steady hand. It was a small, almost microscopic detail, but it was a significant crack in the story of a violent struggle. Next, he looked at the call from Emily's phone to Daniel's. It was a powerful piece of evidence. But Corbin was a student of human nature. He put himself in Emily's shoes. You're a young woman, at home alone with your baby. A man you find unsettling is in your backyard. And you're scared. What do? Do you call the man directly, on his cell phone, provoking a potential confrontation? Or do you call your husband, your mother, 911? The call to Daniel felt wrong, counterintuitive. It felt like a move a killer would make, a piece of stage dressing, not something a real victim would do. The final, and most crucial, piece of the puzzle came from a place no one had thought to look. Eleanor's own meticulously kept, perfectly ordered world. Corbin, on a hunch that was more of a desperate prayer, got a warrant to search Eleanor's home and her car. Her grand, silent house was, as expected, immaculate. They found nothing. But in the trunk of her silver Jaguar, tucked away in the side compartment with the emergency road kit and the spare tire, they found a small silver picture frame. It was the frame that had been stolen from the crime scene. It was a staggering mistake, an act of supreme, almost unthinkable arrogance. In her perfect, meticulous planning, In her diabolical attention to every detail of the frame-up, she had overlooked one simple detail. She had kept a souvenir. It was the act of a narcissist, a killer who needed a trophy, a tangible reminder of her own perfect crime. Corbin now had the physical evidence to connect Eleanor directly to the staged robbery. But he still needed to destroy the core of the case against Daniel Russo. He needed to prove that Eleanor, and not Emily, was the one who was obsessed with the gardener. He went back to Eleanor's phone records, which he had subpoenaed earlier. He wasn't looking for calls to Daniel, but calls about him. And he found them. In the weeks leading up to the murder, he found a series of calls from Eleanor to the landscaping company that employed Daniel. He interviewed the owner of the company, a gruff, no-nonsense man named Sal. "Oh yeah, I remember her," Sal said, rolling his eyes. "That Mrs. Jennings. A real piece of work. She called half a dozen times. Kept changing the schedule for this little rosebush job. But what was weird was the questions she asked. Very specific questions about Daniel. Is he reliable? Has he ever been in trouble with the law? Can you guarantee that he'll be the one to do the work and not one of your other men?" I thought it was strange. It was like she was vetting him for a job that had nothing to do with gardening. That was it. The final damning piece. Eleanor hadn't just used Daniel as a convenient opportunity. She had chosen him. She had researched him. She had meticulously set him up, casting him as the villain in her deadly play long before the curtain ever rose. Corbin now had the complete, horrific picture. A crime born of a cold, suffocating, and pathological hatred, and a frame-up executed with a diabolical, chilling precision. All he had to do now was present this new, terrifying narrative to a son who still believed, with all his heart, that his mother was a saint. The case against Daniel Russo was a house of cards, built on a foundation of lies, and Detective Corbin was about to blow it all down. But he knew the most difficult and most crucial part of his investigation was not the legal battle to exonerate an innocent man, but the human one. Convincing Mark Jennings that the real monster was not the man in the jail cell, but the woman he called Mother. Mark, in the weeks since his wife's murder, had retreated into a shell of profound, paralyzing grief, a state of mind that made him completely dependent on and vulnerable to his mother's manipulations. Eleanor had become the sole pillar of his shattered world, managing his home, his child, and his grief with a suffocating maternal control that left no room for independent thought. To suggest to him that she was a killer was not just an accusation. It was an assault on his entire reality, on the very foundation of his life. Corbin decided that he needed an ally, someone from inside the family's sealed world, someone whose voice Mark might be able to hear through the fog of his grief and his lifelong devotion. He went to Emily's sister, Sophia, a sharp, no-nonsense lawyer who had always viewed her sister's mother-in-law with a deep, abiding suspicion. He laid out the entire case for her in a quiet coffee shop, far from the prying eyes of the press. He told her about the inconsistencies at the crime scene, the plucked hair that was meant to look like it was from a struggle, the stolen picture frame found in Eleanor's car, and the series of obsessive, vetting calls Eleanor had made to the landscaping company. Sophia listened, her face a mixture of dawning horror and grim, terrible vindication. "I knew it," she whispered, her voice trembling with a cold, contained fury. "I always knew she hated Emily. I always knew she was a monster. I never imagined she was capable of this. Mark, he's not going to believe you. She has him wrapped around her little finger. He's a good man, a brilliant doctor, but he's a child when it comes to his mother. He has a blind spot a mile wide." "I know," Corbin said. "That's why I need your help. He won't listen to me, a cop, but he might listen to you. You're Emily's sister. You have to be the one to plant the first seed of doubt." The intervention was staged with the care of a delicate and potentially explosive surgical procedure. Sophia called Mark, asking him to meet her at his own home, insisting it was urgent. When Corbin and his partner arrived, they found Mark and Sophia in the sunlit living room where Emily had died, a place still heavy with her absence, a ghost in every corner. Mark's face was a mask of confusion and weary grief. "What is this, Sophia?" he asked, his voice strained. "What's he doing here? I thought this was over. They have the man who did it." "Mark, you have to listen," Sophia said, her voice gentle but firm, the voice of a sister, not a lawyer. "We have to talk about your mother." For the next hour, an hour that felt like an eternity, Corbin and Sophia carefully, methodically, laid out the new, horrific narrative. They presented the evidence, piece by piece, not as accusations, but as a series of troubling, unexplainable questions. Why was the stolen picture frame, the one with your wedding photo in it, hidden in your mother's car? Why had she made so many obsessive calls about the gardener before the murder, as if she were casting a role in a play? Why did the evidence of the struggle look so staged, so perfect? Mark's reaction was one of visceral, angry denial. "This is insane," he yelled, his voice echoing in the quiet, sad room, his hands clenched into fists. "My mother is a grieving grandmother. She loved Emily. She is the only thing holding this family together. You're trying to frame her to cover up your own incompetence, because you're too lazy to build a real case against Russo." He was shouting, protesting, his entire being rejecting the monstrous possibility that was being presented to him. But Corbin could see the cracks beginning to form in his certainty. He was a man of science, a doctor. He was trained to look at evidence, at facts, at patterns. And the facts, as they were laid out before him, were beginning to form an undeniable, monstrous pattern. The final, devastating blow came from a place Corbin had not anticipated. It came from the only other witness to the crime. As Mark was pacing the room, raging against the impossible accusations, his 1-year-old son, Leo, who had been sitting on the floor, playing with a set of wooden blocks, became distressed by the shouting. He began to cry. It was a fretful, anxious sound. And as he cried, he reached his little hands out towards his father and repeated a single garbled word, a word he had just recently learned to associate with pain. "Nana. Ow. Nana. Ow." He wailed, pointing a chubby, uncertain finger at the empty space where his mother had died. A profound, deathly silence fell over the room. Mark froze mid-stride. He stared at his son, his face a canvas of dawning, gut-wrenching, and absolute horror. "What did he say?" Corbin asked quietly, though he already knew. "Nana. That's what he calls my mother," Mark whispered, his voice barely audible, the sound of a man's world collapsing in on itself. "Ow. It's what he says when he gets a bump, when something hurts." In that moment, the entire horrific picture snapped into focus in Mark's mind. His son had been in the house that day. He had been in his nursery just down the hall. He had been a witness, and in his own pre-verbal, innocent way, he was telling them what he had seen. He had seen his grandmother hurt his mother. The collapse of Mark Jennings's world was a terrible, silent thing. He sank into a chair, his face ashen, his body shaking with a grief that was now 1,000 times more profound than what had come before. He was not just mourning a murdered wife. He was mourning the loss of a mother, and the entire, love-filled history he had believed was real. The foundation of his life had been revealed to be a lie. With Mark's reluctant, heartbroken cooperation, the final pieces fell into place. He remembered a detail he had long forgotten. The silver letter opener from his father's desk, the one Eleanor had always kept polished on the mantel. He remembered her taking it from the old house a few months ago, saying she wanted to have it appraised for insurance. It had been missing ever since. He also remembered his mother's almost obsessive knowledge of his schedule, her insistence that he attend the all-day conference on that specific Wednesday, even when he had considered sending a junior partner in his place. The arrest of Eleanor Jennings was a quiet, surreal affair. Corbin found her in her grand, silent home, in her perfectly manicured rose garden, snipping off dead blooms with a pair of silver shears. She showed no emotion as he laid out the evidence against her, her face a mask of cold, imperious denial. Even when he told her about the picture frame, about her grandson's words, her composure did not crack. "The child is babbling," she said, her voice like the snap of a frozen twig. And the detective is a desperate, foolish man, grasping at straws. I will be vindicated. But she was not. At the trial, the weight of the evidence was overwhelming. The testimony of the landscaping company owner, the forensic analysis of the staged evidence, the discovery of the stolen frame, and the powerful, agonizingly emotional testimony of her own son, who recounted, through tears, the years of quiet, poisonous malice she had directed at his wife, all combined to paint a portrait of a monster hiding in plain sight. Daniel Russo was exonerated and released, a man whose life had been nearly destroyed by a web of lies he had never even known existed. The city, in a rare act of contrition, offered him a substantial settlement for his wrongful arrest and imprisonment. Eleanor Jennings was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. She received her sentence with the same cold, reptilian calm she had maintained throughout the trial, her head held high, a matriarch to the very end. Months later, Corbin saw Mark Jennings and his son in a local park. They were throwing a ball, the little boy's laughter echoing in the crisp, autumn sun. They were a broken family, two survivors, trying to piece themselves back together in the shadow of an unthinkable betrayal. Corbin thought about Eleanor, sitting in her prison cell, a queen of a silent, empty kingdom of her own making. He had unmasked the monster, but he knew that the wounds she had inflicted, born of a mother's love that had twisted into a monstrous, possessive hatred, would be a long, long time in healing.